Moving on with the ESA topics, this time we will take a look at the policies. This session is going to be an introduction to this topic. We will just take a look at the engines from a very high-level perspective, and then also talk about policy processing. Okay, the purpose of using ESA policies, like policies on any other type of security appliance, is just to allow you build, configure different control settings for different groups of users or maybe individual users for the purposes of enforcing a certain policy in order to comply with your internal requirements. Now on the ESA, as we will see, it's going to be all about configuring certain inspection engines, enabling them, tuning, and then specifying what exact messages we want to scan with what engine. In order to use ESA engines, policy engines, you will first thing have to enable them globally. You'll have to activate the engine, kind of like turn it on for the appliance as a whole. You will then have to tune or at least enable this engine in the default mail policy. The mail policy, as we will see, is going to be our main tool used to control what messages are going to be eventually inspected with what engines. So we will have a separate policy for incoming and also outgoing messages, where the element that we are going to use to distinguish between these two types of policy tables is going to be our host access table. So host access table is going to be a critical component because it's going to be that feature of the ESA what will eventually define whether a session is supposed to be scanned by the incoming versus outgoing engines. As we discussed in the previous session, whenever we have a match in a mail flow policy configured with the accept action, we will treat the connection as incoming, versus when we have a match with a mail flow policy configured with the relay action, this is what we will then hand to the outgoing mail policy, or just policy engine table. Okay, so just to recap on the actual engines that we will be able to tune, enable, disable in our policy, it is going to be anti-spam, which as we just saw, could be used to quarantine messages deemed to be junk, to be coming from unwanted senders. We can scan messages, look for viruses, enable advanced malware protection. We can also identify gray mail and give users a chance to securely unsubscribe. We can look at various portions of the message, trying to filter the attachment, maybe drop the message based on certain information, possibly using regular expressions. We can prevent zero-day viruses by quarantining suspected emails. And finally, we can also control outgoing messages looking for sensitive information. So some of those features, they will only apply to incoming policy, and some of them will only apply to outgoing policy table. Now, probably the most important thing to remember about when you add new policies to the policy table, incoming or outgoing, for policy engines scanning, is gonna be the address information you wanna use as your condition. This is how we are gonna build our policies. It's gonna be based on the sender information, like from the envelope, or maybe from the message header fields, from or reply to. Sender information is gonna make one type of conditions, with the other one being the destination of the message. In this case, it's only gonna be the envelope portion, the recipient from the envelope, and specifically, it's always going to be the final address seen in a message, what's going to be used by our policies. ESA offers many features that are capable of changing recipient information, like for example, when you map domains, maybe use aliases. So in this case, the recipient is always going to be the final address seen in the message as it is being processed by the policy engines, not the original one, assuming that it was changed. Now, since email messages can be sent to more than one recipient, like when you build a message, you send it from your account, but you specify 2 or more addresses in the to field of the message, it might be needed by the ESA to virtually break the message down into more than one virtual message, which is known as splintering. So message splintering is all about copying a message to the memory, making a virtual copy of a message for the purposes of enforcing the right policy. Because think about the following scenario. Let's say that our message was sent by a single user. I'm going to say that the sender is simply X. But the message is destined to more than one recipient, like A, B, and C. And now ESA is configured with more than one policy in the policy table. So we assume that this is going to be the incoming policy table, what we will use to evaluate this message. And we have 2 policies, policy 1 and policy 2. Now, policy 1 is specifically meant for recipient A, where the other policy is meant for recipient B and C. And now the problem here is that we have a single message which is sent to recipients that would normally match different policies. So we cannot evaluate this single message against just one of those policies. Because user A is supposed to be processed by policy 1, where 2 other recipients' message sent to those recipients is supposed to be processed by the second policy. So ESA is going to solve that by making a virtual copy of that message. It is going to break it down into 2 parts. Like message 1 is going to be still coming from X, but it is going to be destined to A. And then the second message is going to be same source, but it will be sent to different recipients, B and C. So in this particular case, splintering results in just 2 virtual messages. It's not the number of the recipients what controls the number of copies. It's the number of policies that we will eventually have to use to process them. So this way, a single message could be processed with the appropriate policies, depending on the, in this case, recipient. All right, the entire policy table is going to be evaluated from the top to the bottom. We are with incoming policies. This is what we will use to test our engines. Maybe let's just add a custom entry for a single recipient. I'm going to say that this is going to be Kate policy, because the only condition that I will use here is going to be a recipient. So I'm going to say that this policy will be evaluated regardless of the sender. The only thing that has to match, so we have a match with this policy, is going to be the recipient, Kate at example.com. Okay, you could also choose any as the recipient. You could use LDAP if you configured it to perform some additional validation, to specify some other conditions, and you could finally use the kind of like the exception option, which is everything but the following recipients, or maybe everything but the following senders. So the source is going to be any, destination is going to be this single user. This is my conditions. In this case, I will not check this option. In this particular case, we have just one recipient defined, but we could also use the OR processing logic instead of AND, like if you were to define more than one condition. I'm going to say OK. And we will submit and commit this change. I'm going to leave the policy engine settings at their defaults. Like on the web security appliance, the custom policy by default takes the default policy settings. So anti-spam, it says use what's in the default policy. The same for everything else. So normally you would probably want to tune the default policy first before adding custom policies to save you some work.